I want to start acknowledging how insightful has been this 2 days of workshop with the diversity we have in many senses around questions, ideas, solutions, around how can we close this gap, how can we understand what is this gap between designing strategy and implementing strategy from different perspectives, from different types of projects and research. And let me give you a quick overview of some data that we collected with the support of the Economist Intelligence Unit. So they did a survey with 500 senior leaderships around the globe. And we have some interesting data here just to get started and to provoke the discussion. So for 59% of the respondents or senior leaderships, they believe that they often struggle to implement their strategies. And for most of the organizations, or 90% of the organizations, they are not able to implement all their strategic initiatives. And on average, for some organizations, and in this particular survey, we found that 20% average of strategic initiative will fail or will have problems during the implementation. 62% of these senior executives, they admit that implementation is not seen as a strategic task, which is interesting because if you have a strategic planning, or you have an idea or a master plan for implementing our strategy, implementation is key. So they should turn their focus on implementation and consider implementation as a core competence for organizations. And that's where we as researchers, we can try to help these organizations, or even not only from the practice standpoint, but also the theory standpoint, what's happening. So I would start with a question related to the main theme for this conference, which is characterizing the gap. And I would like to start by thinking about, can we tell what is the gap, or characterize this gap? And from a literature theory standpoint, if you take a look around the publications, there's much emphasis on developing strategies, framework, practice, to come up with ideas, to plan those ideas. And we don't see the same relevancy or the same quantity of work doing in the implementation side of the strategy. I want to start with these questions for our panelists. Can we characterize what is the gap and why is important to understand, first of all, because we started our conference by asking questions to understand the problem. So the problem would be, what is the gap?
Who gets to go first? Okay. Well, then I'll go first. Thank you, Eddie. I think, from my point of view, there are two parts to that answer. I think, and both have to do with actually asking a slightly better question, if you ask me. The first one is that I think we have to be careful not to slip into a one-size-fits-all mindset. And if there's one takeaway from the work that we've been doing recently, talking to senior executives, is that there is not one kind of strategy and one kind of implementation. But there are several different kinds of tasks of strategy work that have different best ways of implementing that and driving that into the organization. So I think that is one part of where we need to start asking better questions, not just the strategy implementation gap, what particular aspect are we talking about here. The second one, or the second aspect here, is that I'm not 100% convinced it's the best way of asking the question, and that comes from let's say from my engineering design thinking background. There we've learned a long time ago that good engineering does not happen that you write the perfect requirements and then you're done with that, and then you start designing your system and then you're done with that. And that is a little bit the mindset we're bringing to the strategy. So we define the perfect strategy and then we execute against that. And I think as engineers, we're a lot smarter about how to run that process, and I think we need to transfer some of that thinking into the strategy conversation of having more of a realization of the co-creation between requirements and solution space. And it's been, almost every speaker has had something to say about that dynamic relationship between strategy and implementation, that it is not two different things, but happens in mutual dependence. So I think we need to get smarter about that part as well, and then asking the question accordingly. Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree with my friend Joseph. In some ways, I have a little bit of regret that we've focused on the gap for this meeting, because really what we want is for strategy and implementation to really be one thing, right? We want, when we talk about strategy, what we want is for strategy to include formulation and implementation. So to the extent that does not exist, then I guess the question then becomes a problem-solving exercise. You know, let's diagnose why strategy and formulation and strategy implementation aren't happening together. And you know, we've heard a lot of talks during this conference about, you know, places where things fall down. There are just numerous ways. But as we go forward, you know, we can focus on the gap, or we can focus on the whole thing that we want to see in the future. And then, you know, if we focus on, you know, the whole strategy process, then we can start thinking about what are the deficits? You know, what are the failed connections? Where has somebody failed to establish enough capacity? Are there enough bridging mechanisms in place? And are there failed investments? You know, there are a number of questions that go along with, you know, why is it failing to be the way that we think it ought to be?
Thank you. So I work with many established Japanese companies who has who are struggling how to implement their strategy into implementation. So from my experience, there are mainly two gaps. One is the motivation of the employees to implement their strategy. So however clear and however correct the strategy is, but if the strategy has been implemented, the employee might lose their jobs after implementation of the strategy. So that kind of motivation can prevent the implementation of the strategy. And for example, so I work with energy sectors. So the many technology come into the energy sector that might change the business model from the bottom. But most of the conventional engineers related to the conventional technologies might lose their job. So we have to convey or obtain the resources from that kind of business operating sections. And another one is skill. So the business environment will be changed dramatically. So the strategy is very clear to adopt the business environment. But unfortunately, conventional companies doesn't have skill, organizational skill, in terms of, for example, digital technologies and other things that agility, I mean speed of decision making. So that kind of future business environment might be very quick, but unfortunately, we Japanese organization takes time to make decisions. So we are struggling in mainly two points, I guess.
Thank you. So I think it was a good start. Let's, I want to open the floor for anyone that has a couple of questions, and please choose the hardest one, and so we can take the advantage of these three lovely guys here to help us understand what is the strategy, or what are the problems and how can we solve them. Does anyone have any question that we can start? Don't be shy.
My question goes towards transition. So you have a strategy, and we're talking about bridging the gap, but what happens when that champion for a particular strategy or the team goes away? whether suddenly or planned. Through your research, have you seen, I don't want to say a cookie cutter template that would help that company or organization transition, but what are some of the key takeaways from that particular issue?
I guess I would first of all say that if the transition of a leader away from the organization results in the strategy failing, then I would say that their strategy implementation was failed to begin with, because that if the success of the strategy depends on one person, then it's pretty fragile. They haven't engaged across the spectrum of strategy formulation. People, chief executives or whoever's tasked with that responsibility, they also haven't engaged with the downstream implementation units. They haven't developed a bridging mechanism, so they don't have a transition function in place. If you don't have those elements in place, then I think it's unlikely that you're going to have success if there's just one person who's advocating a specific strategy.
So, violent agreement with what Eric just said. The concrete examples that we've seen is, answer one is always, well, have a charismatic leader, somebody everybody follows, who has the trust, everybody who's also exceptionally smart and is never wrong. So great, that is option one. But now we're saying, well, maybe we don't have that person. And then it's back to organization, because good organization allows ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And we've seen examples of that. And then my answer would be, well, buy the project, program, and portfolio management book. Because the organizations that we've worked with, and I have one in particular in mind, that is sort of your picture postcard implementation of best practices around program management. Also the story that I think Eric and I have seen at BMW with a large transformation that involved a lot of different people. There was very clear leadership, but a strong, in that case, PMO, which kind of buffered you the professionalism of your strategy implementation against the ups and downs of single characters in there. Then again, how do you get there? Well, with visionary leadership and so on. So I think it's hard to become independent of good people doing good work, but I think it's also a mark of good leaders that they create structures around them that work, even if they're not personally pushing it continuously.
Yeah, I agree with Eric and Joseph. So strategy, if strategy is completed, planning is completed, so that should not rely on one specific person. So systemically, so we should follow the plan to implement it. That is the best case, but I would like to add these elements to one thing. Passion is needed. So passion to implement a plan. So if only one specific person has passion to implement, that will fail. So we should obtain other followers, other members' passion to implement the strategy. That is another key to success, the implementation of the success of the strategy, I guess.
So my question is to Kenji Tanaka. So my question is to Kenji Tanaka. You mentioned very interestingly that there is a problem in executing strategy if what you're executing is disruptive to the workforce itself, right? For example, you're doing something that's going to change your business model and some people will go out of jobs or whatever, right? So given that disruption is actually, a fact today and seems like no business is really isolated or immune to that. So have you seen any good or a best practice or any kind of a good example where a company might have dealt with this kind of situation? Although you said it's a challenging scenario in Japan, but in general, is there an example that you think was done well?
Thank you for your question. So I only know one company who was successful to transfer the business model. So that name is Fujifilm. So I have many friends at the company. So they are losing their revenue by 30% annually at around 2000, year of 2000, because the film is disappearing. And they started their digital camera business from the beginning of the digital camera comes. So their strategy was disrupting their original businesses. But I found that they are still surviving. And they are still one of the established company. So I was invited to their board meeting, and they are saying many good things. But so they have will to implement their strategy, and they get financial profitability from the other businesses to support the transition of the strategy. But I think that is the two keys. But I don't know if it's universal or not.
I maybe have a follow-up to that. One of the companies that we work with, larger company, they have at any time sort of 5 to 10 major strategy initiatives rolling. And what they're doing really well is, as part of the portfolio management of their strategy initiatives, where you look at your critical resources and your timing and who does what when, they actually very explicitly think about, they call it the amount of oxygen that a strategy initiative is sucking out of the organization. That is their mental model. That there are some strategy initiatives that are, where they say that's going to be really painful for people to do. For example, I figured out that if I move, Department A to a different country, 50%, 60% bottom line cost improvement. Great. They sit down and say, is now the time to do that? We really want to do that, but here's all the other stuff that's going on, and here's our experience with what the organization can deal with at any point in time. And they don't get it always right, but they're getting it more and more often right than wrong, because at the top level, they start thinking about, okay, how much energy is it going to take? What kind of mechanisms do we have to ease the pain a little bit? What kind of experiences do we have? We'll move into sort of classic change management topics. And it sounds trivial when you look at it, but given that there's only a few organizations that we've encountered so far that actually do this, I think they have a good thing going there. And it requires a lot of experience and also some degree of trust in the top level management, together with a very professional strategy staff organization that then also works very closely with the operating units who are going to be affected by what's being talked about.
So I want to follow on from the first question that was asked, which is what happens when the leader leads to the strategy? I thought it was a great question. It made me think about a couple of things, particularly Eric's comment, well, it wasn't a good strategy if it was dependent upon the leader. It made me think about work of Elliot Jacques, who studied time span capacity, and that leaders had certain capacity to see in the future, which I think relates directly into organizations, and then how many levels you need. His book was Requisite Variety on that. But I think the question that I'd like to ask each of the three of you is, can you study strategy without studying leadership, which is different than studying leaders? And if so, what's your approach to studying leadership?
It sounds like you have a theory.
You want to answer?
Yeah, what you're thinking.
Well, we've talked about leaders, but we haven't talked about leadership, and I'm recognizing that by the opposite of the question that was asked. And is it possible for us to make progress in strategy implementation without also developing a theory of leadership?
Can I be provocative on that? Is leadership overrated?
I think so.
Well, but I think when we talk about strategy as a construct, let's unpack what we think. First thing we think of is top down. You have the leaders of the organization, and they're going to define the strategy. They're going to tell everybody what the organization needs to do. So therefore, if you have the absence of leadership, then do you have the absence of strategy? Are there examples of organizations that are self-organizing? Like Gore, for instance. And then you have distributed models of leadership. So then we move away from a top-down model of leadership to one that's more distributed, or perhaps there are other models of leadership that confound our existing notions, that we adhere to. And I agree that they're coupled, perhaps because we involuntarily couple them in our own minds or in the constructs that we use.
If we consult the airport self-help literature shelf, we find a number of books, the 10 characteristics of a great project manager, and then the next one is the 10 characteristics of a great engineer, and we will find a number of books on the 10 characteristics of a great leader. And I don't mean to say that we shouldn't study these things, and there's certainly a dependence on the processes and the organizational structure that you choose and the kind of people that you plug into that organization. It's not any kind of character can execute any kind of process in any kind of organization the same way. However, I often have the feeling that sort of the reliance on leadership is sort of the cheap way out of saying, well, I don't understand what the tasks are and how we should do this, and they're kind of messy. So let's just get the best people in, and they're going to figure it out without much additional guidance. And so I think, yes, we should study it, but I don't think it's an excuse, or it shouldn't at least lead to being an excuse of not looking at actually the task and the kind of jobs that need to get done, and maybe retrofitting the kind of characters that we'd like to do that. And coming back to my initial statement, there's a lot of diversity there on the leadership level. Anybody who works with senior executive knows there is not the one type. It would be kind of boring work if there was. But there are a lot of different leaders, so it's not surprising that they come up with a lot of different ways of implementing strategy and so on. But I think at the end of the day, we can make good progress by learning a bit more about the kind of tasks and how we solve them. Again, to move it from a craft that people learn by imitating others to something that we can maybe even teach at universities of how to do better. So to separate the two a bit. So I'm quite happy continuing to look at the process and organizational level for a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to add about your comments, and I agree with Eric's distributed leadership. So nowadays, project requires various kind of talents. That means so we can find the talents within our groups. So we need to ask somebody else to cooperate with the project. So that means, so I think ecosystem or the project is very necessary. I mean, it is necessary to design ecosystem and facilitate the ecosystem work well. So it's, I'm sorry, I just know Japanese industry. So Japanese leadership style is not top-down style, but facilitating style. So that in the long term, so we obtain many resources from other companies or stakeholders. So there are many kinds of leadership, but so from now, so we should add some elements of leadership elements to existing leadership model to conduct complex model. So in that sense, researches works well to analyze what will happen after the leadership comes between the stakeholders, I guess.
Thank you. I'm gonna ask. We have 7 minutes because we need a hard stop at 2 because Jovs needs to leave and get a plane. So I want to ask the 3 participants to do a very quick, in 1 minute, if it's possible, an overview of the conference and what's next. what you wish for and what you're gonna pursue in your research, or what we learned here that you can take next level in your research. So it's a summary, and then what's next.
Thank you for letting me go first. No, the first thing I'd like to say is, man, just being a participant, just like you guys. So thank you all for very, very interesting 2 days, and also a big thank you to Brian and the team who made this possible here at MIT. I think it's really fun to share time with people that are interested in sort of similar topics, and I appreciate the collegial and open atmosphere. I also appreciate the sort of the diversity of opinions, even including opinions such as Vic Tang. So insists on a. Yeah. I'm trying. Yeah. I think what's clear is that it's a very diverse field, and that's good, because I think we need to embrace that. But I think we also have some homework to do of creating more of a sense-making framework around the different ways that we talk about strategy and strategy implementation. And that is, I think, my main takeaway here, that I think we can make a big step forward if we're able to help ourselves, in that case, us as academics, but also practitioners, in saying, okay, here's the kind of situations that I can look at, here are the kind of activities, maybe also the kind of leadership styles. Here's all of that fits together. And here are a couple of stories from practice of what works and what doesn't work. I like Byron's talk on the narratives and the storytelling, because I think that is a very, very powerful way of sort of conveying a message. So, long story short, I think great that we're looking at so many different things, but I'd like to see a little bit more of a sense-making framework. Not that we need to agree on the one best way of doing things, but there's a way how we can talk about our different answers to the same question.
Yeah. So thank you to everyone who shared. We've had a diverse set of perspectives that we've seen, and I think that it is up to us collectively, including Brightline, to find a framework that will include all of these different perspectives. Because I think we've heard about classic business school strategy conflated with leadership, top-down perspective. We've heard about project implementation and management. All of these things are elements of what we think is the future state, which is that strategy is formulation, it is implementation, it is coordination, it is building capabilities. It's a number of different activities that we've all talked about in this conference. And so, I'm looking forward to moving into that next stage of continuing to collaborate with my colleagues here and with all of you. And my wish going forward, I hope that the SDM students have all seen the light, that strategy implementation is the future, and that they want to come talk to me about doing research. So.
And I learned a lot from these 2 days. So starting with how issue is important before solving the issues. And I learned a new word of process in physical. That is very impressive to me. I will use this word in Japan. By the way, so I learned and I realized there are many gaps between the strategy and the implementation. So what I want to do next would be, I think there are many good guidelines Brightline has. So 10 principles can be introduced into those gaps. So my next challenge would be how to follow the strategy implementation. I mean, in terms of the first question from the audience. So we have to rely on specific one person. So we have to follow systemically when the strategy is implemented. So, so the next step would be how to follow systemically implementation of the strategy with those principles. So that would be my next challenge.
Well, thank you. So a round of applause for Dan. Thank you for the great panel.
Let's see, can we get some support from the projector? There's AV. Okay. Well, listen, I promise you very, very briefly there will be a chance for a bio break, so just bear with me for just 10 minutes. Yeah. Please. Yeah. Yeah. We talked a lot. And I agree with Joseph that we need to, and Eric, that we need to find a way to increase complementary ways of talking about these underlying phenomenon. But I would go back even to Francis Bacon, who railed against Royal Society and others and said, we also need to have more evidence, I think. I believe strongly that if we are going to pay attention to these particular layers and intersections that perhaps fall outside of previous scholarly work, then we need to balance our thinking with our exploration of what's really happening and not draw conclusions too quickly. So we've set up 3 workshops that we think will be suggestive, will be an experience for you, that in a model-based way that we're looking to sense, to build new detectors for teamwork that falls on the strategy implementation bridge. And as soon as the projector warms up, I will tell you about it. Briefly, I'd like to kick off the workshops to give you some context for what will be about an hour and a half experience. And we'll come back here after your workshops to do a debrief together. But the context begins with understanding a little bit about what our students learn, not what we teach per se, but what we learn. There are a lot of methods that we trip across in systems thinking. Of course, one of the fatal flaws is to confuse the tool or the method with what we're actually teaching. And when Bruce and Eric and others and I talk about it, we're really trying to understand how can we almost rewire the brains of our students and really make them ready to be leaders because of these various sets of capabilities. And so we have all these methods that we teach in this incredibly rigorous class. And I want to point out it's not just process. I'll do deference to Deming. It's not just process. There's a strong leadership component, really for a much more organic integration of these set of issues around systems, both organizational and product systems. And we hope there's a deep intellectual basis somewhere under the covers in ways of thinking, solving, interacting, implementing, and learning. And if you know Ed Crawley, I think he'd agree with that as well. And one of the indicators is the ability to frame, or more importantly, to reframe. So we'll talk about leadership in SDM in the next 2 weeks. And I might disagree with a passive academic view of leadership. I actually believe it's incredibly important, especially in a policy world. But we'll talk more about that. But I hope that stimulates a conversation with those who've studied leadership. Of course, at the heart of this is engineering, which we focus on as a human activity. And in that human activity, we understand that there's agency. And therefore, agency as one of the kind of drivers of emergent performance and also emergent uncertainties. So given this context and this view, we want to ask, and we want to ask more deeply in an MIT way, why do some teams perform well and not others? If you've been a musician, you play a quartet, and the score is known, right? And even if you're with very talented, capable other musicians, sometimes, for some mysterious reasons, what emerges is quite remarkable. What is that? Can we see it? How do we become aware of it? So we, in a group that we call GTL, Global Teamwork Lab, which is both here at MIT and at University of Tokyo, we're trying to dream up new ways of digging in and understanding these phenomenon when what we call teams of teams work on systems of systems. The scale here is inherently the mesoscale. There has been lots of interesting work at the small team level about personalities and backgrounds and capabilities. And there's also been work that looks, I think, more at the macro scale, about at the firm level or even sometimes the economic level. But our study is at the team of teams level, which is somewhere between 7 and maybe 350 people. And we would argue that scale is where the level of dynamics occur that drives most of the kinds of complex projects that we're interested in. We're trying to do that with the combination of 3 different research capabilities. One is system of systems modeling. And of course, what's important is that we're not talking about a master model, some giant SD model or some giant SysML model, in which themselves may be incredibly beautiful, but inherently there's going to be a federation of different models that, whatever language they use, need to come together to allow us to draw conclusions. So how do we do that? We're also focused on interactive visualization, not just visualization, but the way the visualization acts through interaction with others, and for the first time, really focusing on the embedding of sensors in the interactive visualization. I visited recently a company that has a beautiful cave. Have you been to these caves? You know, with all these wraparound, it's not your company, but a wraparound, very expensive, and all this beautiful modeling. And they were showcasing it to us, and they were talking about the workshops they do there every month and so forth. And I asked first a simple question, which my social science friends would like, which is, do you survey or interview the participants before and after? No. So let's go beyond that. In all this equipment I'm looking at, how many sensors do you have? When people come in here and use this environment, how do you know? You just told me that it's wonderful. How do you know? So we want to, and going back to Francis Bacon, we want to make sure that as we pursue this approach, that we're balancing our models and our frameworks and our good thinking with a much more radically empirical approach. Because I think that's what it's going to take for us to get to the heart of the phenomenon at the mesoscale. And so you're about to participate in 3 pilot experiments that our students have been developing, and we just hope you have fun with it. I mean, you're not going to be, it's not an experiment, it's an experience today. But we hope it helps you to first have an image or a vision of what we're trying to do, and then also we hope it attracts you to maybe think of developing your own or replicating one of the experiments that we've been working on. Here is some of the recent experiments. I think 2 of these are being made available today. One is an idea generation, and our colleague in Tokyo, Professor Hori, has developed a number of techniques, digital sticky notes, and different ways of categorizing ideas using analogical thinking and so forth, but they heavily instrument the workshops. An example of that instrumentation is their happiness counter, which, similar to what I think you saw Professor Hiyakata and Shinosuke's show earlier, that during the workshop session, can we actually begin to correlate what's happening emotionally, or at least reactions, as one way of interpreting actions, interactions, decisions, and so forth. Another experiment that I think some of you can participate in today, this was created by Ira Winder and Shinosuke together. This is a strategy game based on transition to natural gas in the shipping industry. And the set of investments that must be made fall across traditional industrial actors. So the port maritime, port regulation, the shipbuilders, the ship owners all have to, in some sense, coordinate in thinking architecturally across the set of investments they might make. And so as you explore this set of decisions, you'll be able to see an interactive simulation and some of the outcomes from that set of decisions. And that is in, which room is that today? Do you know? It's one of the three. All the way at the end. All the way at the end. So this is room 2, around the corner. The next one is, some of you may be familiar with this, so if you've already worked with my project management work, feel free not to show up. But this is a model-based project, model-based project management. And similarly, you'll be given two exercises to collaboratively think about the visual expression and then later the improvement of an engineering project, which is the integration of an organization system, a process, and a product system. Okay? And this is, our students do this here every year. You know, of course, a part of all of this, and the third experiment is what Ira will lead today. This is his earlier work, and shows kind of the heritage in the as-built environment for what Ira's been working on is tangible interfaces. And today's experiments, there is a tangible interface, I think, related to the pharma. Is it the pharma? It's actually a GSK example. And it is, I believe, an investment, a production decision. I've never played it, so I don't know. And also, you're going to be doing a game related to parking and autonomous cars. Okay? So those are the 3 workshops. So as you participate, first of all, have fun. And please help us think about how can we, while we're still doing our framing and our deep thinking and our surveys and our ethnography and our model building and our simulating, can we somehow also bring a much stronger empirical basis to our work? And we would argue that means whatever we're doing, we need to begin adding instrumented teamwork into this agenda. Okay? So there are, I think we've set up 16 across the 3 workshops. There's 16 tables, which will sit easily 3 people around a large screen. So we ask if you find one of these 3 that you're interested in, dig in, stay throughout the hour and 15 minutes that we're going to be doing this. If you're not sure or there's not a seat available, which I doubt, then feel free to just walk back and forth and get a feeling or a sense. So we're going to reconvene here after just around a few minutes before 4, maybe quarter till 4, and we're going to do a debrief on what you experienced and hopefully show you some of the data from your own experiences. Okay? You ready? All right, let's go.